The Impossible Girl, Joan of Arc's divine conspiracy. Picture this. A teenage peasant girl, barely literate, walks into the court of a desperate king and convinces him to hand over command of France's most elite military forces. Within months, she's reversed a century-long losing streak against England and changed the course of European history. If this were fiction, publishers would reject it as too unbelievable. But Joan of Arc's story isn't fiction. It's the most audacious real-life conspiracy in medieval history, one that still defies explanation 6 centuries later. The setup. France on its deathbed. The year was 1429, and France was dying a slow, humiliating death. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for nearly a century, with English forces and their Burgundian allies systematically carving up French territory like vultures picking at a carcass. The French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was so ineffective that many questioned his legitimacy. Rumors swirled that he was actually the bastard son of his mother's affair, making his claim to the throne worthless. But here's where the story takes its first impossible turn. In the remote village of Domremy, a 17-year-old farmer's daughter named Jeanne d'Arc, she never called herself Joan, began experiencing what she claimed were divine visions. Not gentle, mystical dreams, but urgent, commanding visitations from the Archangel Michael, Saint Margaret, and Saint Catherine. Their message was explosive. God had chosen her, a nobody from nowhere, to save France and crown the Dauphin as the rightful king. The hook that should have failed. What happened next defies every rule of medieval society. In an age when women couldn't inherit property, testify in court, or speak publicly, Joan somehow convinced not 1, not 2, but 3 separate layers of male authority to take her seriously. First, she persuaded the local captain Robert de Baudricourt to grant her an audience with the Dauphin. Then she convinced Charles himself, despite having no credentials beyond her unshakable conviction. But here's the detail that historians still puzzle over. Joan knew things she shouldn't have known. She correctly identified the disguised Dauphin in a crowded court, despite never having seen him before. She revealed details about his private prayers and secret doubts that only his closest confidants knew. Was this divine revelation, exceptional intelligence gathering, or something else entirely? The mystery deepens when you realize that Joan's sudden appearance coincided perfectly with France's most desperate hour, almost as if the timing were orchestrated. The military miracle that shouldn't have worked. Joan's military genius presents perhaps the greatest puzzle of all. With no formal training in warfare, strategy, or tactics, she somehow developed an intuitive understanding of siege warfare that baffled seasoned commanders. Her first major test came at Orleans, where English forces had maintained a stranglehold for months. Every military expert predicted a bloodbath. Instead, Joan engineered one of history's most stunning reversals. But here's what makes it truly extraordinary. She didn't just win through conventional military brilliance. Joan's secret weapon was psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. She understood that wars are won in the mind before they're won on the battlefield. Her white banner, her distinctive armor, her absolute confidence, these weren't just props. They were carefully crafted symbols that transformed French morale while striking terror into English hearts. The English were so unsettled by Joan that they branded her a witch, convinced no normal human could achieve such impossible victories. They weren't entirely wrong to be terrified. In just 4 months, Joan lifted the siege of Orleans, captured a string of English strongholds, and opened the path to Reims' military achievements that should have taken years, if they were possible at all. The coronation conspiracy. Joan's ultimate objective wasn't military conquest, but political transformation. Everything she did was aimed at one moment: the coronation of Charles VII at Reims Cathedral. This wasn't just ceremony, it was political alchemy. In medieval France, a king wasn't truly legitimate until he was crowned in the sacred cathedral where Clovis, the first Christian king of France, had been baptized nearly 1,000 years earlier. But here's the masterstroke that reveals Joan, sophisticated political understanding. She knew that military victories meant nothing without religious validation. By insisting on the coronation at Reims, she was invoking the most powerful legitimizing force in medieval society, the Catholic Church's divine sanction. When Charles knelt before the altar as Joan stood triumphantly beside him, she wasn't just crowning a king. She was rewriting the entire political narrative of France. The coronation also reveals Joan's most audacious long-term strategy. She wasn't just trying to win battles. She was attempting to reconstruct French national identity itself. Before Joan, France was more a geographical concept than a unified nation. By linking military victory with divine mandate and royal legitimacy, she was forging something unprecedented. The idea that the French people were chosen by God to resist foreign domination. The capture, betrayal, or sacrifice. Joan's downfall at Compiègne in May 1430 presents one of history's most intriguing questions. Was she betrayed by jealous French nobles who feared her growing power? Did the Burgundians orchestrate an elaborate trap? Or, and this is where the story becomes truly mysterious, did Joan walk into capture deliberately? Consider the evidence. Joan had repeatedly claimed that her mission would last only about a year. As her first anniversary approached, she became increasingly fatalistic, speaking openly about her coming capture. At Compiègne, she made tactical decisions that seem almost designed to ensure her seizure by enemy forces. Was this prescient knowledge of her fate, or a calculated sacrifice to cement her legend? The Burgundians' immediate decision to sell Joan to the English for the astronomical sum of 10,000 francs suggests they understood they had captured something far more valuable than a mere military commander. They had seized the living symbol of French resistance, and both sides knew it. The trial, theater of legitimacy. Joan's trial in Rouen wasn't really about determining guilt or innocence. It was an elaborate performance designed to destroy her credibility and with it, French morale. The English understood that simply executing Joan would create a martyr. Instead, they needed to prove she was a fraud, a heretic or worse, a witch whose victories came from demonic rather than divine sources. But Joan turned the courtroom into her final battlefield. Faced with 70 charges ranging from heresy to cross-dressing, she delivered a defense that was simultaneously defiant and theologically sophisticated. This supposedly illiterate peasant girl matched wits with university-trained theologians and canon lawyers, often turning their own arguments against them. Her most brilliant moment came when asked whether she believed she was in God's grace. It was a trap question claiming certainty would be heretical presumption, while expressing doubt would undermine her divine mission. Joan's response was masterful. If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there. Even her enemies were impressed by this theological rope-walking. The execution and the immortal mystery, Joan's death by fire in Rouen's marketplace on May 30th, 1431, should have been the end of the story. But death only amplified her power. The executioner's attempt to display her charred remains backfired spectacularly, instead of proving her mortality. The gruesome spectacle convinced many that a saint had been martyred by God's enemies. Within months, French forces began winning again, inspired by Joan's memory. The English position in France, so secure just 2 years earlier, began its terminal collapse. By 1453, they had been expelled from all French territory except Calais. Joan's prophecy of French liberation had come true, even after her death. But here's the final, haunting question that historians still debate. Who was Joan of Arc really? A divinely inspired saint? A sophisticated political operative whose peasant innocence was carefully crafted persona? A genuinely mystical figure whose visions happened to align with French political necessity? Or perhaps something else entirely, a perfect storm of personality, timing, and circumstances that created a historical impossibility? The Catholic Church canonized her in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, officially recognizing her divine mission. Yet the mystery remains. How did an illiterate teenager from a backwater village become the savior of France and one of history's most fascinating figures? Joan of Arc's story continues to captivate because it represents something we desperately want to believe in, the possibility that one person, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, can change the world against impossible odds. In an age of cynicism and institutional power, Joan reminds us that sometimes, just sometimes, David really does defeat Goliath. And sometimes the voice of God might speak through the most unlikely messenger of all.